Loren, there's this quotation in your paper that I was really kind of mesmerized by Gabriel Tupenambá, which is psychoanalysis is renewed not through doctrinal accumulation, but through the transmission of what forces analysts to listen differently. The institutional circuit gives body to the hypothesis of the unconscious. Close quote, which I think is beautiful and resonant in a lot of ways, but also I feel like gives us a nice way of just getting into the very idea of the institutional circuit itself.
Gabriel's work has been very influential in the past couple of years. He published a book, I believe in 2023, or at least it was translated into English in 2023, entitled The Desire of Psychoanalysis. And in this book, Gabriel is a Brazilian analyst. He's also involved in a number of clinical experiments in Brazil. Brazil has been a hotbed for free clinics. The entire question of the infrastructural turn, which we might discuss later, is rooted in much of the experience in Brazil. He's a Brazilian analyst, and he's also involved in political organizing, militant groups. And in Desire of Psychoanalysis, Gabriel turns to the institutional formation that he was most familiar with, which is Lacanian formation, specifically through institutes that are associated with the World Association of Psychoanalysis, which is the international organization founded by Lacan's son-in-law, Jacques Lacan. In some ways, it's a theoretical book. I mean, in many ways, it's a theoretical book, but it's actually, in my mind, a real intervention into what he calls the ideology of, or he calls Lacanian ideology specifically. Much of what he confronts in that book is applicable really to any institutional psychoanalysis. I think that there's something really particularly engaging about him discussing these institutional and political crises within Lacanian psychoanalysis, because when Lacan when he formed his school, he attempted to, in a way, rigorously structure it to avoid some of the common political, ideological pitfalls of psychoanalytic transmission that had really become commonplace since the formation of the IPA. Right. So, what did that mean? It meant that being a member of Lacan's school was not tied to credentials. It was not tied to specific licenses. It was not tied to the hierarchies of professionalization. And he had developed this now kind of infamous procedure of the past, which I won't kind of go into, but it really centers on the transmission of psychoanalysis and the nomination of analysts through the testimony of their own analyses. So I think what was so powerful about Gabriel's intervention is that in some ways it might feel easy to be critical of, various IPA institutes, American psychoanalytic institutes and so forth. But he was able to show that even under the conditions in which the formation of analysts was really challenged and reorganized so that the transmission of psychoanalysis was primary over the accreditation of a psychoanalyst, even in those institutional contexts, group psychology is unavoidable, ideology, the repetition of certain signifiers that really become a kind of stagnant and defensive compulsion to protect certain institutional frames and so forth were very present in these political crises that he maps out.
I really appreciate what you're saying and the call out to Tupenambá's work in particular, but also to thinking about the existence and different histories of psychoanalysis outside the immediately American context or narrowly transatlantic context. I think there can be a type of various types of chauvinism or necessary bandwidth limitations that can manifest where people will as we debate, the vicissitudes of is psychoanalysis the regnant field? What can this possibly say to social work or anything else like that? We're always oftentimes speaking in a very post-World War II, post deinstitutionalization, post-turn to psychopharmacology, and all these terms like presuppose specific institutional histories, like, the success of what we might call ego psychology in the US, but also global historical conditions, as you write in your most recent piece, namely like refugee diaspora flows of analysts and situations in other places, which may have a lot to say to us, from the terms of political economy or in terms of libidinal economy. I think here about the Brazilian example has so much to say about austerity politics and policing and racialization, et cetera. But that these are also places where like the supposed like utility of psychoanalysis or the existence even of psychoanalysis it's given, or at least it's open to other types of questions. You can get undergraduate degrees in them in many of these places. Like it doesn't necessarily literally mean like the heavily Austrian accented, essentially laughable figure who like Don Draper goes to see in a couple episodes. Like there is this kind of engagement with the social, and even more so, too, I think what I really appreciate about the quote and about your work as well, right, is that it's this paradox of, one, having like a lot of text, a lot of concepts to draw on. And if we wanted to articulate or extrapolate, quote unquote, doctrines from it, I suppose we could. And many people internal to Lacan will differ about this, or people will import Lacan, as actually sometimes a good friend of mine who's an analyst has said, as a way of having theory to get around the difficult problem of actually existing real people, right? And again, I love a lot of Lacanians, love you all, look at the work you're doing, right? And I support it. But also, there is this way in which what I think the Lacanian enterprise, as you've just described it, highlights, and this is, I'm also trying to make a gesture to audience members who are like, don't know the global history or are singularly attached to Lacan in a particular interpreter, et cetera, right? Is that what Lacan does through these institutional modes and through these different approaches to accreditation, or even through like theorizing institutions as such, right? Is that he puts front and center an awareness of collective processes and encounters with like these both circuits, things that move and are circulated, but also ways in which circuits have resistances or they have short circuits, or in any event, they're always dynamic and contingent and oftentimes volatile. And I think that quintessentially dynamic orientation is something I think we can't lose sight of, whether we are drawn to chauvinistic American thinking or to narrowly theoretical like exegesis. It's the appeal to continually showing up and working through, and sometimes feeling the short circuit in your own self.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so pleased to welcome back to the show Loren Dent. Loren Dent, PhD, is a clinical psychologist in private practice and co-director at the Greene Clinic, a sliding scale group practice in Brooklyn. He sits on the board of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis, where he's on the steering committee for the Community Psychoanalysis Training Track. He's also an instructor at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Loren formerly served as the team leader for Lenox Hill Hospital's first episode psychosis program and is currently a consulting supervisor for the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine's Heads Up program for early psychosis. Ordinary Unhappiness listeners will remember Loren from an episode we did about like a year and a half ago, something like that, on Lacan and psychosis. He's one of our favorite conversation partners. Loren, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure.
So you've been on the show before, but I think it would be really helpful to orient our listeners in terms of your current work and some of your intellectual preoccupations before we get directly into your thinking about community psychoanalysis or psychoanalysis for the people. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the institutions that you work in at present?
Yeah, of course. As you mentioned, I'm a psychologist in private practice and co-director of the Greene Clinic. The Greene Clinic is a sliding scale group practice in Brooklyn, where we see a very wide range of patients in terms of age, income, race, ethnicity, gender presentations. I believe a little over a third of our patients at the Greene Clinic pay under $99 per session. More than a third of them have household incomes less than $40,000 a year, which for those of you who do not live in New York, maybe we could do some math later to translate it. We also, about a third of our patients are LGBTQ, queer, gender nonconforming, or trans. So even in this discussion today, I'm mentioning some of this because the question of community and the signifier of community is something that is, overdetermined or underdetermined in different senses and has real concrete material stakes and ethical stakes in terms of how we define it, right? So in a sense, we work with a community that is in some ways geographical, in some ways defined by material conditions, identity conditions, and so forth. But they're different communities. And there's also the community of the clinic itself and those who work there, the decisions we have to make in terms of things like the sliding scale fees and what we prioritize in establishing those fees, what people get paid, what we get paid for different things. So in many ways, as we talk about community psychoanalysis, there's much to be said about the day-to-day decisions, choices, losses, priorities that are all governed in different ways by ethics, political thinking, one's personal history, and so forth. And it's something that I'm kind of, along with colleagues, several colleagues, kind of embedded with every day at the Greene Clinic. Part of the Greene Clinic is a program that my colleague Matthew Oyer and I founded called the Constellations Program, which offers multiple services for mostly young people experiencing psychosis or extreme states, where they have access to intensive psychotherapy groups, family interventions and meetings, as well as medication management when appropriate, and work with what we call the liaisons, who are able to accompany patients in their day-to-day life to accomplish certain basic needs, goals, creative projects, and so forth. So the Constellations program is something that has been a large focus of mine in the past 2 years in particular, and in some ways sort of ties into my increasing concern with community psychoanalysis, because the question of psychosis is one that is always raised in community settings. We could talk about this in more detail later, but deinstitutionalization that began in the 1950s meant that many people experiencing psychosis and other forms of serious mental illness are now accessing treatment in community settings, which also raises questions for psychoanalysis, particularly these historical, what I believe to be kind of resistances to a certain kind of psychoanalytic work under the auspices of analyzability, of appropriateness of treatment, and so forth. These are, sort of inevitably tied to any question around doing psychoanalytic work in a given community, and particularly in the context of deinstitutionalization and community mental health in places like New York City and other places.
I want to do two things. Namely, first, just express my personal appreciation for the work you all are doing. I'm glad it exists. And second, I want to say, with an eye towards people who are coming at your work, or even the question of what is psychoanalysis for the first time, to underscore and gloss at the same time how some of the terms you've used, like analyzability, right? Who does or doesn't count, or who is or isn't susceptible to this procedure that we would call psychoanalysis, much like the term of psychoanalysis itself as a procedure, that these are not essential ahistorical givens, and that we could equally say, and I think a lot of your work encourages us to do this, to think about like the implicit notions of like who is, if we are going to straw man this vision of psychoanalysis as 4 days a week, 50 minutes, and you're paying $300 a session, right? Who is the actual community for that, right? Or like if we essentialize psychoanalysis as being this particular practice that emphasizes even terms like neutrality and the like, what actually is the fixity or the stasis or like the frozenness of what that is actually offering as a service, as a way of thinking, as institutional communities, as a class-based modality or restricted for treatment, et cetera. And again, it's part of my appreciation of what you're doing is calling our attention to rethink those presuppositions.
Absolutely. And there's much to say here. Something that struck me about Gabriel's work, and really, in his challenging of what he calls Lacanian ideology, he makes a point that, might seem obvious to some, but I'm not so sure it is obvious, which is that psychoanalytic theories, and in his case, he focuses on, in Lacanian theory, the signifier as a construct. He points out that, well, the theory of the signifier in Lacanian theory, and again, I think this applies arguably to any conceptual signifier from any theoretical orientation, emerges out of specific conditions, that is, dyadic, private, psychoanalytic treatments, where he, one aspect of what he calls Lacanian ideology is the, in his mind, hasty extension of something like the signifier to a level of abstraction, right? That is divorced or becomes divorced from the specific conditions in which the theory develops, right? So again, this I think is true for, take any concept like transference or the unconscious or resistance or fantasy interpretation. If we trust, despite the plurality of psychoanalytic theories and schools and terminology, if we trust that those theories emerged out of clinical work, psychoanalytic clinical work in different historical contexts and different material contexts, then we also have to question or raise what it means when those conditions change for the theory, right? And the quote, that you read earlier, Abby, from Gabriel, the way I read it is that he's calling for a renewal of psychoanalytic formation or training, including within institutional contexts, though I don't think it needs to be limited to that, in which the learning of theory, the development of theory, and even the articulation of potential new theories arise out of the contact or encounters with new particular conditions, including particular patients. So just to bring it, down a level, if an analyst positions themselves in the context of, let's say, a group of care workers in a refugee crisis center, for example, right? Gabriel is asking, what does one hear in that specific context that cannot be merely absorbed by the existing or pre-existing conceptual categories that the analyst may have, right, for the work. What in listening contests one's own theoretical, alliances and frameworks, right? So I think when he calls for a renewal of listening and tying listening to the formation and the learning of psychoanalysis, I really think it's in many ways just an extension of, Freud's, while inconsistent, but Freud's calling for a kind of listening in which something new can be heard.
It also strikes me that, and I haven't read this book, although I'm certainly going to do so now. I think we often think about theory as this thing that then gets applied in this thing that we call the real world, right? And what I'm hearing from you is more like theory pushes on the world pushes on theory. Like these things are dialectically related. And that's, I think, a really helpful way to understand both of them, and also understand both of them as like not these kind of fixed things. I feel like we could keep going down this rabbit hole for a really long time and it would be very, very fun. And I'm not going to allow myself that temptation because it is my job to make sure that the work group continues its task. I want us to zoom out collectively and do a little bit of ground clearing for our listeners. One of the really lovely things about doing this show is that we often get to read work in progress by people whose thinking that, we find really exciting. And that was absolutely the case in preparation for this episode when we had a chance to read a paper in progress of yours, Loren, called Preliminary Questions for a Psychoanalysis for the People, which you just presented at a meeting of the Association for Psychoanalytic Medicine in early March 2026. And it's fantastic, and it gets into so many issues and questions of core interest to our show and to many of our listeners. I want to ask you a couple of questions, not all at the same time, I promise, but that are in this mode of like ground clearing and defining our terms as we make our way into this thing called community psychoanalysis for the people, and the way and the kind of conversations and lines of thinking that you're finding productive in this project. So in your paper, you start by surveying the history of psychoanalysis and the way that it's been, in your words, quote, marked by repeated confrontations with social catastrophe, which have forced the field to revise its theoretical and institutional foundations, close quote. So can you give us some noteworthy examples?
Sure. Well, in the early 1900s, the psychoanalytic movement was very fragmented. And what that meant, and certainly Freud's concerns about the movement were driving this, but what that meant was a kind of anxiety about the perseverance of such a new discipline and form of treatment. On the other hand, what the fragmentation meant was that there were many groups, associations formed in different places that allowed a certain autonomy in the development of psychoanalysis, different ways of working, different ways of theorizing, and so forth. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytic Association was founded. And, this is one of those cases where, depending on whose intellectual history you read, Freud was either kind of the primary driver of this. He was against it, or maybe he was ambivalent about it. I think it's pretty, in my mind, I think he certainly was ambivalently driving this, particularly because of what he perceived to be the attacks on psychoanalysis, both politically, intellectually, from medicine, from the universities, from states, and so forth. So the IPA was founded in a kind of defensive maneuver to protect the longevity of psychoanalysis. Of course, the IPA was around, was only 4 years, 3 or 4 years old, and the First World War breaks out. And suddenly there's a degree of social disaster, collective disaster, that, unlike other historical times, I'm thinking about, the United States now, perhaps the role of institutional psychoanalysis in Argentina during years of dictatorship. There was something that was sort of unavoidable in Europe at that time for psychoanalysts with the war. Why? Because many analysts were on the front lines as medical workers, certainly as the war went on, soldiers, civilians, inflicted with physical and psychical trauma showed up in various clinical contexts and medical contexts, which required the attention of psychoanalysts who were responsible in different ways for their care. So from 1910 to 1918, the year in which this famous Budapest conference occurs, where Freud calls for a psychoanalysis for the people, you see a tremendous amount of change happening, both in terms of solidifying or attempting to solidify institutional psychoanalysis, but at the same time having to account for clinically and theoretically something catastrophic. So, we know that, of course, 1920, Freud publishes Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is, I think, in my mind and to others' minds, a response, a theoretical response to the war. And in 2 years prior, as I mentioned, in 1918 is when he reads the famous Lines of Advance paper at the Budapest conference, calling for eventually free psychoanalytic clinics for the masses suffering from neurotic misery. World War I is, sort of one defining point. And then, of course, the exile of analysts following the Second World War, many of whom came, went to Britain, many came to the United States, fleeing, many of whom were, Jewish, facing different forms of anti-Semitism in the countries to which they fled. In the United States context, the refugees, the analysts who were refugees following World War II, arrived and faced an entirely different set of pressures, cultural pressures, political pressures, and professional pressures that ultimately led to the alignment of psychoanalysis with medicine in the US. Lacan is, comes to mind in his, very well-known critiques of ego psychology, particularly American ego psychology, that emphasized adaptation, strengthening of the ego. What he doesn't quite acknowledge in the historical context is the pressure of adaptation for those analysts in the American context.
I just want to underscore that. And I've always thought, you have to have different modes of charitable reading, but also like critical reading at the same time when, in the Lacan that most people read and stop at, like the mirror stage, right? There is this brutal sort of drive-by destruction of both the Lacanians and the ego psychologists in the same breath. Like they're just imposing theory on people, and the ego psychologists in particular want to make people adapt. And honestly, they're making them adapt to American capitalism, but why not adapt to be camp guards? And this is all this kind of like, it's savage in this way. By the same token, though, and this is what I again really appreciate about the stories you're telling it, if you read the work of, I'm thinking Emily Kurloff in particular, whose book Contemporary Psychoanalysis and the Legacy of the Third Reich, I think is a magisterial account of this, to say nothing of the actual quality of the work of many of these analytic sort of ego psychologists in the first place. Like I have a real fondness for Heinz Hartmann, for example, right? I don't think it's a fair reading to reduce their thought to a mere sort of like reflexive commercialized adaptation thing. But what Kurloff does in her literal interviews and historical sort of accountings for, as you say, refugee, immigrant, diaspora analytic populations in the US, and I think also in Israel and to a lesser extent in Latin America, is these are people who are fleeing trauma, for whom the stakes of not just like preserving psychoanalysis, but like preserving the legacy of Freud himself, a phrase that really proliferates around this time, qua the guy who wrote these books, qua like the bust you have, or the people who wrote all the books behind you in the session. That is not just a question of like abstract commitment to dogged orthodoxy. If we're going to be psychoanalytic about our the things that we look for, like, well, if your family and colleagues die in the Shoah, then the question of like legacy or who you get to bring over is overdetermined, to say the least. And likewise, a lot of those ostensibly theoretical concerns, like, well, don't talk about what happened to you at work or your current sex life. Let's talk about what happened in the distant past with your family. And I'm also not going to say that much as an analyst. Well, if you think about the fact that many of those cases, these analysts are of necessity trying to adapt to an environment in which they are speaking a language that is not their first language, whether it be Hebrew or English or Spanish. And they might have their own reasons not to be that interested in recent trauma as opposed to the distant past. Suddenly, the relationship between, well, the community of analysis and world historical experiences becomes much more, well, poignantly legible.
Absolutely. It's worth noting that, many of these analysts, when they, between the wars in Europe, took up the call for these free clinics. There were places like the Polyclinic. This history is, very well documented in Elizabeth Danto's book. In arriving at the United States, to your point, Patrick, there was also, inevitably going to be a kind of necessary silence about the conditions of their being displaced in an exile. Because anti-Semitism was, of course, pervasive in a much, sort of different kind of way in the United States at the time, which makes me speculate that, the professionalization of psychoanalysis in the US among these refugees was premised on a certain historical silence of the conditions for their arrival, right? Which, as we sort of look back now and there's such greater attention paid in psychoanalysis to collective and historical trauma and not the sort of singular biography of a given patient, it makes, it also kind of makes perfect sense why that would be repressed for so long within professional American psychoanalytic organizations. That repression of the conditions, the catastrophic conditions for exile, I don't want to overstate it either, because of course, some of these analysts were involved in, for example, the founding of the New School, right, and sort of in dialogue with the Frankfurt School. So I don't want to overstate it, but certainly the pressures for survival among many of these analysts came with a certain censorship of the very traumatic reasons in which they arrived in the U.S. And suddenly being tasked with finding a way of working, again, several of whom were, socialists who had worked in free clinics, were already working outside of the consulting room, finding a way of surviving and working in the 1950s in the US within medicine. Right. Now, the other piece of this, of course, is that it again, sort of not wanting to overstate things, the question of lay analysis was always sort of in the backdrop, right? And Freud, of course, weighed in heavily on the side of protecting the paths for lay analysts to work. And that simply meant at the time, people without medical degrees. this is where a number of kind of current problems, I think, can be kind of mapped back quite a ways. Let's see if I can put this together. There's professionalization, and at that time that meant having a medical degree. In the present, that means a medical degree, a degree in clinical psychology, a license in social work, or in New York, a license in psychoanalysis. So the kind of means to professionalization have expanded, but it's still professionalization, right? Which is tied to a number of constraints that are related to legal directives and limitations on one's license, professional license, liability, insurance liability in one's work, right? That has created my anecdotal experience with colleagues, supervisees, it creates this climate of a tremendous amount of anxiety about the work. And of course, it, limits the paths to which one can work and certainly work analytically. Now, the other piece of this, going back to the question of lay analysis and the formation of the IPA, is that despite Freud's involvement in the IPA as a way of kind of shoring up the transmission of psychoanalysis, protecting it, defending it, he never, you cannot find any evidence that Freud ever believed that one had to go through a particular institutional route to become an analyst.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think his book that you were referencing, or it's almost like a long essay. The question of lay analysis testifies like very eloquently to that point.
Yes, yeah, and there were a number of specific examples of individuals who wanted to train as analysts, and Freud, in correspondences to them, in some cases said, look, you've been working in this clinic for 4 or 5 years. What might be needed now is to enter your own analysis and continue clinical conversations with me, right, as a kind of supervisor. You don't need to go, into a particular association or institute at this point, because in some cases he had a kind of faith that somebody had already demonstrated the capacity to both think and work analytically, right? And there were other cases where Freud, needing to kind of control the scene, directed, some into more formal analytic training or organized analytic training. But these were questions of case by case. For Freud, were cases that were singular. They were not a kind of sense that institutional training was necessary for all, right?
Yeah.
So again, kind of coming back to the present, we there's still this question of, who can take up the title or the nomination as psychoanalyst, and which there are governmental state responses. There are responses within the psychoanalytic community, but it really has, in many ways limited the paths by which those, who want to become analysts can seek.
It seems to me so much of what's at stake in our conversation today is not only expanding that category, but also expanding access, right? And so I'm wondering if we can just kind of tackle our central terms head on for a moment, understanding that throughout our conversation today, we are going to be toggling back and forth between past and present. Loren, what is community psychoanalysis? Or I know you're using the term psychoanalysis for the people. Are those things interchangeable? Why is this, in your opinion, why is this idea of community psychoanalysis, which I'm hearing from people in so many different kinds of circles, right? This is not limited to one clinic in Brooklyn. People in different parts of like the mental health world, broadly speaking, are invoking this concept. So what is it? why is it back? And while I'm demanding of you to define terms, one I think that will be really helpful also for our listeners is a term that you return to in your paper, which is the idea of the infrastructural turn. So will you take a crack at some of these definitions?
Sure. And so I sit on the board of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis here in New York, which was founded in 2024. We have a number of projects that we fund that in many cases provide direct care to, different populations that have historically been underserved by psychoanalysis. This includes emerging adult immigrants, people living with psychosis. We're funding a really great parent-infant drop-in program, work that's being done with people experiencing chronic pain. More recently, we began approving a grant for running groups with political activists. So, and also, and I can speak more of this, we are developing a pilot training program. But I'm mentioning this because when we were in the kind of nascent stages of thinking about this foundation, we didn't hire a PR firm or do any, sort of like market research. But we were,
you didn't get a fancy consulting team.
We didn't get a consulting team.
Not respecting the signifier here, I think.
Yes. I don't know. I think they landed on a catchy title.
No, I know.
So
but
actually,
but is it a signifier if a white shoe Madison Avenue firm isn't involved in it? I don't know.
Community psychoanalysis was a signifier we were familiar with, though, even since, naming the foundation, that certainly my understanding of the history of it, even the history of that term, has deepened. But in the more kind of recent history, the term community psychoanalysis, in my mind, is most associated with programs that have taken up that particular turn in Northern California, in Chicago, in Boston, I believe places like Santa Fe, who have begun developing community psychoanalysis training tracks, specifically within institutes. I personally had been most familiar with the work of Francisco Gonzalez, Rachel Peltz, and their colleagues at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, PINC, where they, over the past, I believe, 10 years, had been developing a community psychoanalysis training track in which candidates can select work within a community partner to count as one of the control cases in their training. I also, in my work with psychosis with colleagues, had met and become close to Nancy Burke, who is at the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis, and they had also just a few years ago approved a new training program in community psychoanalysis. In their setting, and this speaks again just to sort of foreshadow the question of the infrastructural turn, just how different local contexts and infrastructural contexts can really change what something like community psychoanalysis means in practice. So in Illinois, they passed legislation, I don't know which year, which allowed tax districts to hold referenda to pay for their own community mental health clinics, which is great. Allowed them to, at CCP, Nancy and others, to found the Kedzie Center, which is a free and low-cost clinic in which individuals who otherwise could not afford treatment would have access to long-term psychoanalytic treatment. Whereas in typical community health settings, they may be, facing limitations on their care. They may be seeing trainees every year, so they're, having a different therapist every year.
Yeah, lack of continuity.
Actually having long-term psychoanalytic work. So it's a quite different context than in Northern California, but that's also because of the different infrastructure available to them in Chicago. From what I can tell, the term actually was first used by Stuart Tremlow in 2000, I think was kind of the first mention of it that I could find. And I believe Tremlow was associated with the Menninger Clinic. He was in Kansas and had been arguing for the need for psychoanalysis to extend outside of the consulting room. And then it kind of struck me that the terminology sort of disappeared for a bit before being revitalized in the past 10 years. Now, that's just a signifier. There have been for some time numerous other projects that are so rarely heard of, mentioned, discussed in so many academic and clinical settings. I'm thinking, for example, of in Philadelphia, there is the Insight for All clinic, which is run by Deborah Lupnitz. And this provides long-term psychoanalytic treatment for the homeless in Philadelphia. One of many, many, many different projects that one could associate with this movement of community psychoanalysis. I think another factor in this, and maybe a reason why the term has gained traction in the past 10 years, is changing demands by those who are entering training. That candidates, those in different clinical programs, are asking for more experience in this kind of work. Additionally, certainly, speaking more locally here in New York, the younger generation of people who are training to be therapists, analysts, are simply more politically attuned than the older generations. And so this has created, we talked about sort of different social catastrophes earlier, the catastrophes of the present here in the US. The genocide in Gaza, for example, led to really painful, surprising, remarkable conflicts within the field, both institutionally and more broadly. I'm thinking about, for example, this almost symptomatic repetition of inviting and then disinviting and reinviting speakers, of people leaving institutes because it no longer seemed like a climate in which they could discuss certain realities that were happening. There have been efforts by, for example, the American Psychological Association to draft very strict definitions of anti-Semitism that would effectively bar any political speech that challenged the genocide. There was a really pivotal moment some years ago with the publishing of the Holmes Commission report on racism within psychoanalysis, and the remarkable lack of training and thinking about race and class in working with patients. So I think there's something that's happening now in the US context, in which many institutes and larger psychoanalytic organizations are being demanded to listen to the candidates, to those who want to become candidates. And it's been a very challenging time because of that. You can just see the kind of defensive posturing that happens in the silencing of certain political speech, the retaliation against candidates and even senior people within institutes that has played out in the past 3 years. And I think, this actually is, at the same time, this is something that's generative.
Yes,
I think, within psychoanalysis. Again, the catastrophes incite conflict. right? But the entire history of psychoanalysis has been about internal conflict.
You're putting this
Right?
in a way that's so clarifying, and I don't want to be too like precious and be like, this is a case of like psychoanalysis succeeding despite itself, because in some ways, like the question of success is already so overdetermined by logics of the market and adaptation and all that. But there is something in this kind of landscape that you're laying out, both in the present and as it relates to the past, that really, I think, dramatizes what you opened talking about, namely the relationship between changing material and historical conditions and institutional formations and theories and what is or isn't imaginable. And there is something remarkable happening about the fact that on the one hand, from like a geographical perspective, we might be unsurprised that those places, cities, and states in particular, New York being one of the few states, I think California and Illinois, right, where they actually have stipulated legal definitions about licensure for psychoanalysts. But the places where there were obviously large expat communities of psychoanalysts during the 50s and 60s, well, yeah, sure. I'm sure there are lots of high-end law firms out there that do like legal aid clinics or pro bono stuff just because that's where they are and that follows. But then also, and to a lesser extent, you might say for, places, say like in Nebraska or parts that don't immediately come to mind in California when we think about like coastal elites where there are medical schools, well, there might be some residual interest in psychoanalysis too. But instead, I think on a much deeper level, there is a kind of clear desire, to use that language, for something else than what is on offer, both in terms of the regnant medical and other models, but also even what institutional psychoanalysis might want to be or fix itself as or has become ossified into, on the part of people being like, no, we need this. We need to do this. We are a community, and we are communities that have we have a desire for something, and psychoanalysis, as we are remaking it in the remaking of it, offers us some tools for conceptualizing that desire, but also operationalizing it in some sort of dynamic, living, risky way.
Absolutely. And it actually raises a concern that I had laid out in the remarks I made on the panel around community psychoanalysis. Given these long-standing questions around lay analysis, professionalization, and so forth, and who can come to name themselves as a psychoanalyst, those debates, I think, are bound up in what you're raising, Patrick, as well. Because one of the concerns I raised on that panel was that who's doing this work? Well, of community psychoanalysis or community whatever, right? For one, which community is it? And what do we make of the fact that most community mental health workers share the same precarity as those that they're treating? Right. So what analysis is possible either as as an analysand or as a candidate, or what analysis is possible for those who want to become analysts or to work analytically or just to learn about psychoanalysis in a way that their clinical training programs may be nodded to or, whatever. Right. And this is, in my own experience, what I find is that many trainees in any kind of clinical setting who might be interested in psychoanalysis or drawn to psychoanalysis, who, might get some exposure depending on what clinical program they're in, there's this collective phenomenon in which they don't feel licensed to seek it. That there's almost a need for permission to seek it out. Now, there are other reasons for that, right? It's not always clear where one seeks it out or what that even can look like, the different ways that can look. There's also, of course, questions of privilege in different ways of, having the kind of flexibility, the ability to seek it in different ways. There's obviously, those who have to contend with a lot of resistance, racism, and classism when they want to seek something new out, right? Or they're working, they're already working, 50 hours in a particular setting, and it's hard to have the time for it. But I even noticed among those friends and colleagues of mine, when we were in our clinical psychology program, there's almost this kind of sense that, you have to wait and ask nicely, right, to those who are advancing you through this program or some other, sort of person embodying authority. You have to wait, and you have to ask permission. And, for me, because I had kind of encountered psychoanalysis, I was fortunate enough to encounter it in high school, and then continued to steep myself in college. Quite soon in my clinical program, and there were many good things about my clinical program that I'm grateful for, but I also knew I needed more. And so what does that look like? It means finding friends and colleagues who you can read together with, right? Or if you're starting to do clinical work, you can form peer supervision groups. Something else I kind of learned was that you can ask, more senior people who are analysts whose work you respect to supervise you, or to come, read a text together. And they often will say yes, and I think that, for those who are already embedded within community mental health settings, it's already, unfortunately, a group that, characterologically tends to be self-sacrificing.
Moral masochism, yeah.
Not incredibly good at advocating for oneself, perhaps?
Yes.
In the way that is demanded by
Absolutely.
the sorts of suggestions that you're offering here.
And, enter the field with certain ideals, which I would argue, speaking of their access to psychoanalysis, these ideals themselves, I would argue, need to be questioned and spoken about and analyzed, often, right? Because there are these conditions of one's own relation to superegoic demands, moral masochism, the wish to be good, omnipotence, all of the dangers that we, can point to around wanting to do good for others, that then get sort of capitalized upon by those institutional settings and even the training programs. I mentioned in the panel that in 2017, the National Association of Social Work finally had to sort of address this crisis of burnout among social workers. And so they incorporate into their professional ethics the need for social workers to practice self-care.
Nice.
That was their answer to this.
Sorry, I'm just imagining a Lacanian, like a doctrinaire Lacanian, who's like, okay, I don't believe in a thing called a self. However, I am going to respond to the obscene superegoic command to care for that.
Yes.
Loren, I want to pick up this thread about burnout. What are some of the challenges or resistances that you see as the most pressing in terms of what community psychoanalysis is facing? And I mean that both in like the material and psychic registers.
Well, if we think of it more broadly, because within the community psychoanalysis initiatives that are named that, I sort of have a bit of a peek into how the sausage is made in us developing this training program in terms of some of the resistances, the anxieties that are brought up around such initiatives. And, without knowing the specifics, I'm sure every initiative, Boston, Northern California, Chicago, has faced similar resistances. But that's a broader question, which is the question of course, what defines psychoanalysis and defines those who can practice and be an analysand, And so it's well known that there's been kind of this sordid history in American psychoanalysis around analyzability, which has excluded many people from even of course, not just access to psychoanalysis, but even sort of almost the epistemological conditions for receiving analytic work in some way, right? Patricia Garavici has this kind of quip about, for so long, there's been this sense that the poor can't afford an unconscious, right? And I've sometimes thought of it in terms of, the right to have an unconscious, So there's that history, of course. And I think that's, you still see remnants of that in certain ways, although I think that has been largely swept up within what I mentioned earlier in terms of larger anxieties about risk, liability, a kind of almost biopolitical, governmental obsession with the life and well-being of the patient, where any risk is minimized, if not eliminated, where oftentimes you see, individuals coming in with either serious mental illness or, experiencing particular past and present traumas that are referred elsewhere, right? Like this is not, something doesn't seem possible psychoanalytically with such patients. So I think that the sort of analyzability question has been actually almost kind of rationalized under certain bureaucratic and managerial forces. On the other hand, again, with access, there's this kind of other problem, which, going all the way back to the 1918 call for a psychoanalysis for the people, Freud always pointed out that there was just no way that there would ever be enough supply of analysts, or not to mention, and nowadays, any kind of mental health provider, to address the widespread misery of the population. And actually, somebody a few nights ago in this panel from the audience asked this question about, what do you think about these sort of mental health workforce initiatives to expand access, to recruit more people into the mental health field? Those things, I mean, in a way, they sound important and great, but I think it obfuscates a number of questions about who is doing that particular labor as well. And this is why I'm sort of centering this concern on the clinician to be, the collectives that they're in, the institutional settings that they're in, the transferences that are not acknowledged in those institutional settings that create conditions of what's been termed burnout, right? Which is this kind of all-encompassing signifier for a very real subjective feeling that many people experience in this work, among other work. But what it has in common is it almost reminds me of like the old, like classic, descriptions of, is it pronounced acedia? Or like classic descriptions of melancholia, a loss of, almost a kind of spiritual destitution.
I think Anne Svetkovich writes about, is it excedia? I don't know. But in her book on depression.
It depends if it's a kappa or a sigma. But
yeah, it's the noonday demon phenomenon of the saints.
I'm thinking about burnout, going back to the metaphor we had about like circuits, right? And circulations thereof. Like
the institutional circuit. Yeah.
I don't know shit about electrical engineering, but I've definitely while traveling or otherwise destroyed enough appliances by overloading them, right? And I think one of the...
I thought you were going to talk about overloading your mental circuits.
Oh, that's
or your spiritual or emotional.
Yeah, no, I'm right. I'm like one of those old circuit breakers that's like stuck full of pennies, because I guess you can get a little bit more like load out of that. But the point here that I'm trying to make...
That's funny and depressing.
It's true. That is so true. Is that one of the weird things about burnout even before we talk about like all the self-care regimens and the medicalization of it and how we define it, is this kind of way in which institutional circuits still continue circulating people and resources and attention even when you're burned out. Like there's the burnout, like obviously you know, like major depressive disorder, you can't get out of bed, but showing up for work and still sort of doing some kind of work and just existing is a thing that many people do well past the point of being burnt out. Like the circuit continues to circulate despite resistance. I don't even know if this is the word. Like it's like the time, like again, I'm like bad analogies, like traveling, plugging in an American appliance into something else, and then somehow it's still working. Like I'm still like paying my bills on this laptop while it's smoking. Right. The analogy speaks to something that is individual and collective, and about the way in which this kind of inhuman collective carries on in this zombified way despite individuals.
It's funny you mentioned zombie. I was just thinking there's an undead quality to it.
I was too. And as sort of, I mean, as somebody who has had periods of burnout for doing, you know, work in higher ed that, you know, often has huge emotional components, is like, you know, it feels dissociative. You know, you're there, you're not there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know, my sense of like the rise of this particular, I wouldn't even say the experience of what it describes, but the term itself seems to, from what I can tell, correlate with the rise of the language of stress, right? And this is, you know, the kind of sense that the organism has reached a certain capacity, but even, as you're pointing out, Patrick, kind of cruelly being asked to continue, right? Now, the French analyst Paul Laurent wrote a paper that I found really helpful around this on burnout, where he argues that in many cases, regardless of the conditions of work, whether you're a care worker or, I don't know, working in PR, the conditions of work are one thing, but in many cases, there's a psychical dimension to it as well. And I think you see this, you know, especially in the psi fields and the caring professions of all sorts, which again is why I think, you know, in these initiatives to extend access, I think we need to consider access for whom and to what. That would include the question of those delivering care having access to, if it's not psychoanalysis, access to conditions in which they can restore some desire for the work they're doing, right? I gave this anecdote the other night that when I was out of my postdoc in 2015, I was offered a hospital position, and I was waiting on hearing about another hospital position that I wanted. And this initial position at a hospital in Brooklyn, I was to have a caseload of 80 people. And this is their catchment area, their geographical community is a very working class, large immigrant population, a lot of current and intergenerational trauma, 80 people, right? I said yes to the job because I didn't have another offer, and then I withdrew the yes when I got an offer. But it, you know, I think there are, like, even with that anecdote, two different ways of thinking about it. One is that do what I did, and if you're lucky enough and fortunate enough to have options, maybe choose the option where you kind of something that just seems, you know, possible for yourself. But if I took that position, and many people don't have the options I had, right, when they enter this kind of work in those settings, then the question is, what then, given the restraints of that particular institution, of the just amount of people that you're seeing, which presumably would have to be every 2 weeks for people who need a lot. So it kind of, you know, allows for a thought experiment, you know, in those conditions, what could be possible that might allow desire to be renewed, and for one working in that way to not be crushed, right, by the work. Is it access to, more analytic supervision so that in these rare encounters you're having with patients who need more encounters, but these rare encounters you're having, maybe something over time can happen, right, analytically? Is it access to one's own treatment or analysis, right, to really sort of come to speak of the internal superegoic conflicts that might be shaping, some of the demoralization, the exhaustion, the hatred of the place you're in, the hatred of the patients you have, the hatred of yourself. So, what could be possible there? I mean, something that, at Pink in Northern California, they do reflective groups among the staff who work in community agencies. And they testify to how some of these questions around burnout, whether they're labeled that or not, something can really change among the kind of will, the drive, the desire of those working in those conditions, which doesn't, of course, like necessarily change the institutional arrangements, right? So it's a real worry I have about access for the sake of access. Just as like a kind of funny aside, I don't know if the two of you have noticed that almost any time Freud wrote about the poor, he referenced Emperor Joseph II.
I have not noticed that.
And he does so in the 1918 paper. I think he mentions him maybe 4 or 5 times across his writings. But Emperor Joseph II was known for these very unpopular, he was a sort of enlightened despot who, ended serfdom, created edicts for religious tolerance, among other things. And Freud, I think, calls on him as this kind of solution to this problem of the vastness of the misery. And also Freud's acknowledging in this kind of strange way the need for there to be state-based, welfare-based programs that change the material conditions for most people. That is outside the purview of what psychoanalysis can offer.
But psychoanalysis, I think, does, as we've been talking about, and as you've really, I think, clarified in an almost crystalline way, offer us resources for at least rejecting alternatives, like as a necessary step towards thinking what might be better. And maybe to be a little more specific about this, I think about how desire, in the terminology that we've been talking about, in the kind of lexicon or worldview that we're working with here, isn't just like, it's certainly not like lust or joie de vivre or loving your job every day. It is better understood as, or at least it's easier to grasp what it might be after we've kind of really rigorously documented all the ways in which, we're dealing with systems of burnout, of deadening, of continual extraction, be above and beyond the point, or of these logics of like...
It's it's about like revivification.
Precisely. Yeah. And it's about, and I do, even as obviously I reject the monarchy and the imperial logic, I do also like appreciate the appeal to something that is not the simple, the resignation and the indifference of ratifying yourself or resigning yourself to like market-based scarcity logics as being like, we're going to expand access to, a mental health worker who is, going to die young of like an aneurysm or a heart attack and in any event hates themselves, right? Or like, we're going to expand access, I don't know, to like crypto investments in minority communities, or we're going to expand access to the, I don't know, like your capacity to take out a reverse mortgage on your own kidneys. Like this kind of like the simple expression of like the injunction to expand and to open and to give more. These are all, they all presuppose diminishing returns, zero-sum trade-offs, etc. Whereas what I take to be at play in this desire thing, and I love your appealing to the idea of like groups working together, is something that can happen in groups and that can happen in our interactions with each other. And candidly, and I say this to you, Abby, and the audience, like it's something I get out of doing this. It's something I think we encounter in, I feel at teaching, and maybe it's something you experience with patients or colleagues, is that you can have an encounter with somebody else or with other people, and it may be tiring, right? It may be exhausting, but it's not depleting, right? It can somehow be energizing. Like somehow the sum of a collectivity is more than just all its individual parts put together, in a way that, well, we could look at the opposite and be like, yeah, getting together in a meeting that lasts an hour makes you want to die and are done for the rest of the day. Here it's like somehow something can emerge, right? Life does not have to obey that logic.
That's right. Or even, what could be possible if one works in this way and can find a way to suspend the ideal whose collapse leads to a kind of melancholic subjective death, right? Or what could the work look like, both at the large scale of kind of the sort of ethics of doing community psychoanalysis, all the different ways it could be defined, but also the sort of singular person working in, again, community as defined. If they can find a way to not be so attached to the good of their patients, of the community, and so forth in that work itself, right? What ethics could be possible? How can desire be renewed in those contexts? I'm thinking of something as simple too as there are so many, again, anecdotally, this is one of those anecdotes I feel is probably pretty, almost universally true. So many people working in these contexts actually don't have a space to share maybe a dream they had about murdering their patient, right? Who's somebody with a traumatic history, somebody who, has not had access to care before. Something as simple as that, right? Where does one actually speak to the fantasies that undergird this work, that brings somebody to this work, that leads to, these situations of moral masochism, self-renunciation, and so forth? Where does one speak to that? Like, when there's so much ideological, superegoic demand to do good despite one's own life.
Loren, as always, it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Really, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me back. This was great.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely made possible and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our standard edition series, our gerontophilocracy series, and our wild analyses, head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Loren Dent. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.